What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another highly combustible reaction. We're gonna be jumping into something kind of cool, the history guy with Dutch ships of the Golden Age. Let's learn about some ships. Let's learn about some more stuff that's from the Netherlands. Let's learn about all of that right now. If you guys enjoyed the video at any time, definitely go show the history guy some love on this channel. I'm gonna leave it down below inside of the description. Hey, we love our history. Go show them some love, 100%. Let them know Highly Combustible sent you. Go over there, hit it up. Let's jump into it though. Let's check it out together. Let's see what we got.
This episode of The History Guy brought to you by Magellan TV and their new release, Tobago, 1677. In the 17th century, the Dutch Republic, or more formally, the Republic of the United Seven Netherlands, was the envy of all of Europe, described by historian Richard Unger as the most prosperous economy in Europe, and probably the world at the time. The Dutch Golden Age, when the tiny republic dominated world trade, was built on the back of her merchant fleet, the largest in the world, and her shipbuilders, whose skills exceeded the other European powers.
First off, can I just say that this man has one of the greatest storytelling voices of all time? Just the way he speaks, where he pauses, in fact, let's go. And not to mention, the dude has the coolest man room in the back. I see a lot of military coins. I don't know if he's a military guy himself, but obviously he has the respect of a few, because you don't get those coins handed to you for no reason. We got all of the military memorabilia in the back. Like, seriously, let's go. This is a channel to follow.
The ships that fueled the Dutch miracle are history that deserve to be remembered. But before we go any further, I'd like to recommend the extraordinary documentary Tobago, 1677, that you can stream on Magellan TV. I know that many of you are already Magellan subscribers, and Tobago 1677 is a good reason why. I loved Tobago 1677 for a number of reasons, but most of all because it demonstrates all the reasons that I love history and why I produced The History Guy. It is a quintessential example of little-known history that deserves to be remembered. Tobago 1677 deals with a little-known aspect of the 6-year-long Franco-Dutch War. The Dutch defense...
Hey, this Tobago thing might actually be worth checking out. I know you guys tell me to normally skip ads, but I'm enamored. Let's see what we got.
So their colony in what is now the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. The documentary combines first-hand accounts, stunning reenactments, and the current efforts to document the battles in Scarborough Harbor through modern archaeology.
Hey.
And of course, all this came from the world empire that was the result of the shipbuilding that's the topic of today's episode of The History Guy. If you love The History Guy, then you'll probably love Tobago 1677.
Like
and
the
the amazing thing is that
tie.
Magellan TV, which already has more than 3,000 documentaries, adds documentaries like Tobago 1677 every week. It's a compelling reason to continue watching Magellan TV. And if you haven't already signed up for this extraordinary streaming service that is run by documentary filmmakers, then gosh, why not? Take advantage of a special offer of a 1-month free trial by clicking on the link in the description. And after you do, check out Tobago 1677.
Yeah.
From approximately the middle of the 15th century, the area called the Netherlands became unified under first the Dukes of Burgundy, and then
That's a cool map with the lion. What?
The area called the Netherlands became unified under first the Dukes of Burgundy, and then after Mary of Valois, the last Duchess of Burgundy, married Maximilian I of Habsburg, as part of the far-flung European Habsburg Empire. Under Mary's grandson Charles, the empire extended to include territory from Germany to Italy, as well as Spain, then a world power due to their colonization in the Americas. The imperial states of the Habsburg Netherlands were called the 17 Provinces, covering the nations now generally referred to as the Low Countries, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. The unwieldy Habsburg Empire faced constant threats both internally and externally, including significant resistance in the province of Friesland, one of the 17 provinces. The 17 provinces were, even prior to the empire, relatively entrepreneurial. The port of Amsterdam was one of the most important ports in Europe, dominating the grain trade in the Baltic region. This created something of a problem for the Habsburgs. The 17 provinces were known for being independent-minded, taking actions without imperial permission. Most notably, they were relatively tolerant of Protestantism, especially Calvinism, which was spreading from northern Europe in the 16th century. Protestant areas were important trading partners, and in a society based on trade, freedom and religious tolerance were, well, good for business. But Charles V and later his son Philip II were ardent Catholics who saw their role as being a bulwark against the growth of the heresy of Protestantism. Moreover, the empire was nearly constantly at war, including the Habsburg-Valois Wars in Italy and the Ottoman-Habsburg Wars in the Mediterranean. The emperor taxed the 17 provinces, using their wealth from trade to finance far-flung wars, from which the people of the provinces benefited little. In fact, the war sometimes occurred against their trading partners. Finally, both Charles and Philip...
Hey, we got a cat on the screen. You know we love our cats around here. We often see mine jump up in the middle of a reaction. That's adorable. I'm digging this 100%. Like, I've never been on the edge of my seat for some history so much before in my life. This man's talking keeps you locked in. Let's go.
To improve efficiency in the empire by centralizing power, a move that offended the relatively independent-minded 17 provinces, where merchants and guilds held almost as much power as a traditional aristocracy. What had been tension under Charles became open rebellion under Philip. The Dutch rebellion was a conflict between Spain and the 17 provinces that became embroiled in greater European politics, transforming into what became known as the 80 Years' War, or the Dutch War for Independence. In the end, the Habsburgs were able to retake and maintain control of the southern provinces, but the 7 northern provinces were able to resist, forming the Republic of the 7 United Netherlands, or the Dutch Republic, in 1581, although the Republic would not be formally recognized until the end of the 30 Years' War and the 1648 Peace of Munster. The Dutch Republic was small and urban, with a population of just 1.5 million. The population of France at the time, by comparison, was 18 million.
Woo,
and it was extraordinary.
Goodness, that was
Born from
small.
a devastating war, the tiny Dutch Republic would become the most prosperous nation in all of Europe, a center of commerce, science, and art. It would produce a golden age of art that included Rembrandt van Rijn and Johannes Vermeer, of philosophy, including René Descartes and exiled...
Was that the one we learned about the other day? Yes, the lady with the pearl earring, right? The woman with the pearl earring. Something with the pearl earring. I definitely remember that from our Rijksmuseum journey, I believe it was. Very cool. Like, seriously, we've learned so much about Dutch history, but this video right here has some of the best visuals I think that we've seen so far. Just the history guy obviously went through a lot of time and effort to amass this sort of information, this wealth of information.
Rijn and Johannes Vermeer, of philosophy, including René Descartes and exiled Englishman John Locke, and science, including Antoine Philippe van Leeuwenhoek, generally acknowledged to be the inventor of the microscope, and astronomer Christian Huygens, who made many improvements on the telescope, discovered the rings of Saturn, and invented the pendulum clock, as well as prolific cartographers Willem and Jan Blauw. But the driving force behind all of this was trade and the Dutch merchant fleet, which eventually included more than 2,000 ships, more than the fleets of England and France combined. Nearly half of the ships.
Whoa, more than England and France combined. That's a lot of ships. That's a lot of weaponry.
More than the fleets of England and France combined. Nearly half of the ships in all of Europe. Historian Richard Unger explains, the Golden Century saw a prodigious expansion in all phases of the economy. Though agriculture enjoyed considerable improvement, the growth in output and employment was based heavily on commerce. It was trade, goods carried on Dutch ships, which was the source of the prominence of the northern Netherlands on the economic stage of Europe. Dutch ship design and construction were the envy of 17th century Europe. The fleet was not just the source of the trading and military power of the Dutch Republic, but it allowed the Republic to establish a powerful empire. The website of the Dutch Maritime Museum explains, thanks to shipping, trade with the Dutch East Indies flourished. The Dutch East India Company was founded, and Amsterdam developed into the warehouse of the world. Goods from all corners of the world came to Amsterdam, and were traded here for lots of money. There are many explanations for this extraordinary period in Dutch and European history. Relative religious tolerance fostered free thought. The 80 Years' War had created religious refugees, with Catholics moving to the southern provinces and Protestants moving to the north. The so-called Protestant work ethic, which emphasized savings and education, is seen by some historians as an underpinning of the Dutch Golden Age. Others note that the Netherlands had a long history of trade, going back to the period when textile manufacturers in the Netherlands had produced the best cloth in all of Europe, and the dominance of the grain trade. Richard Unger argues that much of the Dutch dominance in shipbuilding and cartography came from Portugal, ironically from the period when both were connected via the Habsburg Empire. The technology then flourished in the Netherlands beyond the relatively restricted Catholic Portugal. Certainly a great part of the story of the Grand Dutch fleet owes itself to a man who described himself as a poor farmer with wife and children. In 1594, Cornelius Corneelzoon van Uitgeest, a farmer who had married a miller's daughter.
He's even got his pronunciations down right. I would have never been able to pronounce that name. You know I fumble with my Dutch words. This is spectacular information. I feel like I'm gaining a wealth of information, even though we literally just learned about some of this stuff in the Dutch Golden Age. We got a reinforcement now. We got somebody else coming in telling us a little bit more, filling in the gaps, filling in some of that detail that may have been missed. Like, it's always good to go back and get third and fourth sources, things like that. Check your sources against each other.
With wife and children. In 1594, Cornelius Corneelzoon van Uitgeest, a farmer who had married a miller's daughter, built a windmill-powered sawmill. The ingenious device used a crankshaft to transfer the circular motion of a windmill into a sawing motion that also used a rack and pinion crankshaft to advance the log. His Patroc Molen, or post mill, was a game changer, as the design website Core77 explains. The importance of the wind-powered sawmill taking off in the Netherlands cannot be understated. Wood production didn't double, triple, or quadruple. It grew by a factor of 30, or 3,000%.
Holy,
it was all in the time
wow.
savings. Using the pit saw method, sawyers could process 60 logs over a span of 120 days. Using a wind-powered sawmill, they could break down 60 logs in 4 or 5 days. What used to take 4 months now took less than a week.
Wow, talk about streamlining your process. Just something so simple as somebody's invention. That's a lot of progress. That's a lot of change. That's ridiculous. 3,000%. You didn't just change logging. You didn't just change like cutting logs. You changed the whole of logging. You changed everything when you get that much production rolling out the door. Like, that's changing the entire game right there with just someone's thought. Someone putting their thoughts into reality. Like, seriously, if it wasn't for our inventors, where would we be? If it wasn't for the creative people in the world, where in the world would we be? Back in the cave still? Rubbing rocks together and sticks together for fire? Like, you gotta love the ingenuity of humans in general. Just how far we've come in the short time that I've been alive is miraculous. It's crazy. So to think that this man with just his one invention changed the whole industry up there when it comes to that kind of, that's nuts. That's crazy.
Nature of the Dutch Republic allowed a revolution in shipbuilding. The Dutch understood trade and so built a different kind of ship. Most European powers at the time expected their merchant ships to be easily convertible to warships. A January 1930 issue of the Economic History Review notes how the reasoning applied in England. There were practical considerations. The king's fleet might be destroyed, in which case the duty of defending the kingdom might revert to the merchantmen. The system was reinforced by policy, the journal continues, by navigation acts, giving preference for monopolies to English shipping, by bonuses to the builders of ships of force, by remissions of customs duties, by prohibitions to sell ships of fighting capacity, by penalties to such masters as would surrender their ships without fighting, and finally, by much reiteration, English ships were reminded of their patriotic duty to build large and defensible ships. But the cost of this policy was simple. Heavier ships with their greater width above the waterline had smaller holds that could carry less cargo, and yet were more expensive to build. The Dutch saw things differently. In the 16th century, they developed the Flout. The website Maritime Logistics Professional explains. Previously, ships tended to be built to perform the dual role of fighting battles and carrying cargo. Thus, their construction was fairly robust, and they carried cannons, ammunition, and combat personnel. The Dutch did away with that. The Flout was lightly constructed, carried only sufficient armament to fend off pirates, and the entire crew was working sailors. To maximize cargo capacity while minimizing crew size, the main deck was relatively small, but the hull bulged out on the sides, creating a fat-bottomed or pear-shaped cross-section. The Flout was relatively slow, but made up for the lack of speed with much greater cargo capacity. Maritime logistics professionals continues. Typically about 80 feet in length, they operated with a crew of about 35 men. They could carry twice the cargo of their counterparts at half the cost.
Wow,
This
twice
reduced
the
cost was
cargo
combined
at
with a
half
greater
the
efficiency
cost. That
that came from
sounds
the
great
nature
to
of the
me.
Dutch Republic, an empire built on trade that avoided many of the tariffs and bureaucratic limits of their competitors. Dr. Donald Harold of Brigham Young University expounds, the ability of Dutch shippers to effectively compete with entrenched merchants like the Hanseatic League in the Baltic or the Portuguese in Asia stem from their cost-cutting strategies. Not encumbered by the cost and protective restrictions of most merchant groups of the 16th century, the Dutch trimmed their cost enough to undercut the competition, and eventually establish what Jonathan Israel has called world primacy. The Economic History Review notes, for example, that because capital was abundant in the Republic, Dutch merchants could borrow money at customary rates of 3.5% to 4%. In England, the legal rate was 6%, but because the crown often borrowed at much higher rates, it could be much higher, 10% or more. English shipwright Charles Devant complained in 1699 that high rates drove English merchants to care not to deal in any but rich commodities. It is the bulky goods, whose returns are not such great profit, that breed most seamen and are the most nationally gainful. But such goods cannot be very much dealt in, where interest is high. Moreover, the Economic History Review writes that the Dutch benefited from a central location along rivers and the plentiful capital, the trading center of Amsterdam. The chief producing regions were Norway, Germany, and the Baltic regions. For all naval commodities, the Dutch were far and away the best customers. Their merchants made large purchases at the season when prices were lowest, paid punctually in goods, in Rijksdollars, or in bills of exchange on Amsterdam, and allowed generous credit in their dealings with native merchants. In fact, the review argues that Dutch foreign investments and trading partnerships often allowed Dutch shipwrights to acquire Norwegian masts and timber at lower rates than could be acquired by Norwegian shipwrights.
Wow, how you gonna get someone else more rights than your own people to your own goods? Hey, the Dutch weaseled their way in there and got it somehow. They managed to get that deal. That's a heck of a deal.
The Dutch could simply build and operate their ships much more cheaply than their competitors, even though they were paying their tradesmen and workers more. The result is that Dutch merchants were simply able to outcompete other nations, underselling them. British diplomat Sir George Downing complained, "And for our English ships, they are rather tubs than ships. I do not know of anything more worthy for His Majesty and the Duke of York in point of trade than to force those that trade from London to Norway and the Baltic to employ our own shipping and put upon them the building merely for bulk without any guns, steerage, or roundhouse, whereby she may carry a great deal and be sailed with a few men." He goes on, "The question here is whether it is not better to have ships of our own, though without guns, and your own seamen employed, than to have foreign ships and seamen employed." But both the English crown and conservative English shipwrights were reticent to change and tried to control the competition through policy. When England passed the Navigation Acts in 1660, their goal was to exclude foreign trade via tariffs. The result was to limit the sort of bulk cargo that the Dutch ships could carry. English merchants became uncompetitive in the Baltic, and ironically, the cost of timber, a bulk item used for building ships, skyrocketed as the foreign bulk carrier ships that carried timber were subject to the taxes prescribed in the Act. By contrast, the Economic History Review notes, the number and excellence of the merchant ships belonging at this time to the maritime provinces of the Netherlands were marvelous in the eyes of all Europeans, astonishing even to the Dutch themselves. This was particularly ironic, given that Dutch harbors were shallow and tended to freeze fully in winter. The review continues. "It was, an Englishman observed, such a spot as if God had reserved it as a place only to dig turf out of. Yet this was the land that by popular count launched 1,000 ships a year, and sent them out on giants' errands through all the seas of the world." But it wasn't just those flouts that allowed the Dutch to dominate world trade. Those flouts were good and steady vessels in, say, the Baltic trade, but to dominate the worldwide spice trade, the Dutch needed heavier-built ships. But one of the strengths of Dutch shipbuilders at the time was that they had a greater ability to innovate and specialize. And evidence
We do know that the Dutch are some innovators. We do know that a lot of these smart people around the world that we're talking about that have created things like the microscope, like all of these things, a lot of them came from the Netherlands.
At the time was that they had a greater ability to innovate and specialize. And evidence comes from one of the most notorious shipwrecks in history. The Batavia was a Dutch East Indiaman, a ship built for the trade to the Far East, launched in 1629. A conflict between the master merchant and the ship captain resulted in a plan to take the ship off course in the hopes of causing a mutiny that would allow them to steal the ship. The attempt resulted in the ship striking a reef off Western Australia. The plight of the survivors is a harrowing tale where the former captain and a small band conspired to murder 110 of the ship's survivors, many of them women and children. When ships arrived for rescue, the mutineers were captured, tried, and either hanged or tortured.
Whoa!
2 were deliberately marooned, making them the first Europeans to permanently live on the Australian continent. While the gruesome story of the Batavia haunts history, the remains of the shipwreck has allowed archaeologists to determine the shipbuilding techniques that allowed the Dutch Republic to dominate the Indian spice trade. The ship was built using a time-consuming method called double planking that allowed the ship to keep the cargo dry. Dutch ships of the Golden Age were of such quality that their quality alone caused wars, Dr. Unger explains. Oliver Cromwell in England, once in power after the deposition and execution of King Charles I, in 1651 took his country into the first of 3 wars against the Dutch Republic. The goal was to undermine Dutch commerce and to capture Dutch ships so that those prizes could be incorporated into the English merchant marine. While England eventually largely prevailed in the 4 Anglo-Dutch wars, the Dutch often held their own. Their well-constructed merchant ships did not prevent them from building successful warships. While they were hampered by smaller ships owing to their shallower harbors, they made up for it in greater numbers. The Golden Age of the Dutch Republic only lasted for about a century. Its decline began in 1672, called the Disaster Year, when during the Franco-Dutch War much of the Republic was overrun. The Republic would recover, but its economic position was never the same and continued to decline due to the cost of participation in the War of Spanish Succession and then the War of Austrian Succession. It would not be fair to call the Dutch Republic a truly modern republic. Joop de Jong of Maastricht University described it as a mix of old and new. And yet Professor de Jong argues that the republic, in a sense relative to the times, had unique values, including protection of the rights of the individual, the influential voice of its citizens, pragmatic tolerance towards other religions in an age of religious hatred and civil war, and a political system and culture based on consultation, persuasion, compromise, and trust. That is to say that the Golden Age of the Dutch Republic represented sort of a proto-model for many of the ideas that were the foundation of the modern world, and it was seen as an inspiration for many of the liberal movements of the 18th century, including for a young republic called the United States. And the strength of those ideas showed in a fleet that, in its time, marveled the world. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History Guy.
Oh my God, more than I can tell you, the History Guy.
Feed the algorithm by making a comment or clicking that like button. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please send those to our suggestions email box. Check out our webpage at thehistoryguy.net, and of course we're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can book a special message from the History Guy on Cameo, and check out our merchandise at teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes of Forgotten History, all you need to do is subscribe.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The History Guy with Dutch Ships of the Golden Age. A marvelous little trip through part of the Dutch Golden Age and the whole Dutch ship era, I guess is what you could call it. Like, we've seen that their whole... we know that they're all trading. We know that that's what a lot of it was. Expanding the empire via trading to different places and things like that. We saw it. We saw where all the Dutch little territories were in the world at one point. It makes sense to know more about the ships. It makes sense to dive into a little bit more about... we're already doing the Golden Age, so now we're here with a little bit more. Go show the History Guy some love on his channel for the love of everything, because the man definitely knows what he's talking about, and he just keeps you so encaptured. It's so entrancing. You have an entrancing voice, sir. I'm going to leave his channel down below inside the description. You guys hit the like button if you liked it, the dislike button if you disliked it. Check out one of my other videos up here. Subscribe right here if you want to see more content, possibly your content. Until the next one, I'm highly combustible. You guys be happy, healthy, safe. I love you to the moon and back. Peace.